I am the Deputy Editor for Special Issues for the Journal of Industrial Relations. So on behalf of the Journal, I welcome you as well. So a lot of welcomes coming from my presence as such, but genuinely welcome. The Journal was very excited when we received the proposal for this special issue on psychosocial hazards in the workplace, broadly speaking. It aligns very much, of course, to the legislative provision in the Occupational or the Work Health and Safety Act. And of course, it's a stone that's gathered moss, isn't it, as it's gone on. And there's so much in terms of the implications and the issues of the provision. And for that reason, and it's a very cutting edge kind of issue, the Journal was very, very pleased to facilitate this special issue. Of course, it wouldn't have happened without the great work of the editors, Alexis Vassiley, who is an academic at Edith Cowan University, John Barratt, who is an academic here, one of my colleagues, Kantha Dayaram, who's an academic at the Curtin University, and John Burgess, who is online, not yet. Anyway, John is at Torrens University. We do have some people online, one of them being my colleague Lucy Taxer, who is the editor-in-chief, one of the joint editors-in-chief of the Journal as well. So look, the way we're going to run this session is that the lovely Alex, who is also on the committee, the IR Society Committee, and who is also doing her honours here in the business school at UWA, is going to moderate the session with these guys. That's correct, right? In terms of just asking a few key questions, and particularly about the papers. I think some of your team, your authoring team, are online as well and may be able to take questions. We'll just see how we go. And it's really a very open discussion. These guys doing a bit of a presentation, but then hopefully we'll have Q&A and we'll have people having a bit of a chat and a bit of a comment in terms of what you all think. So again, welcome. Thank you, Alex. Alex, I am the Deputy Editor for Special Issues for the Journal.
What prompted the special issue from an author's perspective? Obviously, you've now talked a little bit about it from the Journal's perspective, but for you as editors and as writers, what prompted this issue?
I mean, it's obviously a really hot button issue, and over the last 5 years, roughly, we've seen changes to work health and safety legislation, we've seen regulation changes, new ways of practice, and psychosocial hazards are something that I think we think are kind of intrinsically connected to industrial relations. So they're things that industrial relations scholars have written about, but often not as psychosocial hazards, right? So they'll write about workload, they'll write about insecure work, but they won't be kind of using the language of psychosocial hazards. Just sort of thinking about power dynamics at work and kind of broader societal factors and how they impact on the psychosocial hazards. So I guess we were sort of thinking, well, it's a big issue that is intrinsically related to IR. It's time for IR scholars to kind of talk about it, but also kind of reach out to work health and safety type scholars who maybe have written about it or kind of come from a tradition that is less about industrial relations.
Yeah, I think it was also about sort of trying to create a bit of a dialogue between that work health and safety, safety science, ergonomics stuff, and industrial relations, because there's stuff that the four of us as editors would see ourselves as IR people and not safety science people. There's stuff that I think we can teach, and that sort of stuff that would be taken for granted in this room that isn't necessarily part of the analysis of safety science, but also to draw upon the good work that they do, and that sort of the positivist traditions that aren't always front and centre in IR, and actually draw from them and try and use that to tell a better story about what's happening at work. And I think that the space for dialogue between the two camps and to try and overlap the Venn diagram, I suppose, between the two areas is really sort of what was exciting to me when I was talking about it. I think I sort of framed up some of our discussions about it.
Can be defined and approached in many different ways. how does the special issue conceptualize them, and why was that conceptualization important?
Yeah, I mean, the audience sort of probably knows what psychosocial hazards but I think just to kind of recap that sort of anything in the design, management, or organisation of work that can cause stress, which then can lead to both mental distress, but also physical harm and ill health. So they're kind of the human factors, or the kind of invisible hazards at work. So things like and there's a long sort of list. I'm not going to list all of it, but things like work intensity, like workload, bullying, adverse environmental conditions, low levels of control, poor leadership practices, monotony, isolation, even insecure work, which is in the code of practice in some jurisdictions as a psychosocial hazard, but not all. So I guess I think sort of most of the contributions really we're on the same page on kind of what psychosocial hazards are, and then we sort of we're very keen to kind of have an IR sort of framing in terms of looking at power dynamics at work.
Okay, so on those contributions, let's talk about the contribution. Were there any kind of key themes or arguments that emerged across them? Any type of convergences or differences on this stage?
Yeah, thinking about this earlier, one thing I really was pleased about was that across the contributions to the special issue, we kind of got a few contributions from scholars who you probably kind of call straight IR people, and then some from scholars who are more kind of in the work health and safety camp, and then also some from those quite few actually scholars who have been able to kind of do both over many years. So, thinking particularly here of Michael Quinn, he's sort of not the only one. So, I guess what we've been trying to do in a sense isn't new. But yeah, I really like the fact that we were able to engage those work health and safety people. We were able to kind of get IR people to think, well, hang on, maybe we should be able to put IR kind of arguments and framings into space, and then kind of capture those people who for a number of years have been kind of talking about work health and safety as in the industrial context, looking at unions, looking at insecure work, all of those kinds of things. So there was kind of there was quite a lot of complementarity, I think.
Yeah. That's good. I mean, that's the next for cohesive contribution.
But I think also like the discourse between the fields is quite again between the some of the IR. Like thinking about Mark Quinlan's paper, what I read, the part that I really liked about it was taking the safety science context, like job demands and resources, like psychosocial safety climate, and putting them in an IR context. Does that make sense? So they're constructs that for me, what HR and a little bit positivist and outside of my research domain, sort of actually no, these are pretty front and centre for IR if you conceptualise IR in a slightly different way, which is quite nice. And then the other thing that I really quite like, the sort of summing up the special issue with the Nusnin and Thornthwaite article that's combined psychosocial hazards and labour process theory. Labour process theory is sort of, for those one across that scholarly debate, sort of drawn out of the factory and looking at how workers get controlled and how you turn the capacity to work into work, right? And one of the debates and issues with labour process theories, it's often been boxed around what happens in the factory and people's lives outside sort of become discounted. And so by drawing in psychosocial hazards and the weaponising menstruation that they talk about in that paper, really sort of answers some questions in labour process theory that exist, as well as bringing it before critical leadership in the Bangladesh industry. So where we were able to bring dialogue between the areas, that's where the specialists really strong through, and I think contributed quite well.
I definitely have to agree with you there as a let's say wannabe industrial relations academic, which is so good to see. What insights from this special issue do you think will resonate most with work?
I think for me, it's about framing up what is a psychosocial hazard, and sort of I think maybe spreading the borders a little bit as to what you might think, because we often think about things like stress or things like bullying or mobbing or some of these ideas, and thinking about it as they affect an individual. And they were the preconceptions I certainly had coming out of my graduate degree a while ago now. But it's this idea of actually trying to draw them into the systemic things that go in, that maybe these things are manifestations of understaffing or about the reaching of work in personal time, or and some of the things that are more IR issues and things that we've looked at as IR scholars, and actually conceptualising them as contributing to psychosocial safety climate, to contributing to the psychosocial health of the workspace. And I think it's that idea of being able to push that border beyond the individual circumstances that they think, and start to think about IR structures and IR systems, and the power dynamics between management and worker, or management and union, or one of the papers, union employees, people who work for a trade union. That idea of actually trying to think about these things, not just at the level of the incident, but the level of what foregrounds them. And I think the physical safety science has done that for a long time, right? This idea of fatigue is going to make the tripwire more likely to be tripped over, and all those kind of things. And trying to draw that type of logic and thinking into the psychosocial domain is really, I think, would be helpful for whether I've hit the road as a practitioner. Having been a practitioner quite a long time ago, and I can't really claim that anymore. But that I think that would have been cool when I was working as a practitioner. Think about these things and health and safety in that way, and not just in the sort of the incident that you deal with and move on from.
How has the history of WHS regulation shaped this debate, and how can we build more integrated approaches moving forward?
Yeah. Look, I find this absolutely fascinating. When we're kind of finishing off the introduction, I get this kind of newsletter about industrial disputes kind of every week, and it was at the time of the strike of United Workers Union members in Victoria and New South Wales in warehouses, and the key issue there was essentially kind of work intensification, not being treated like robots kind of thing, with these sort of AI type systems, and so that was just a classic example of this is an industrial issue. Workers are taking industrial action, but it's actually a psychosocial hazard. And in the same newsletter, there was like 4 other kind of smaller strikes, stop work, just all across the country, and they're like, okay, psychosocial hazard. And workers have always fought around work health and safety. Going right back to the 1800s. In Australia, the start of capitalism, basically, both physical safety and also things which now we would call psychosocial hazards. But I guess the work health and safety regulation, we sort of did a kind of bit of a potted history of some of the regulation over the long term. And I'm not by any means an expert in this, but what you kind of saw throughout the 70s was these kind of militant workers movements in a lot of the Anglophone world, Australia, the UK, fighting around pain and condition, and also kind of safety issues. And out of that, you get the Rogan's reforms and a lot more kind of state intervention in health and safety in the 1980s. But there's still also, I think, silo both in practice and in scholarship. We sort of called it like the work health and safety system over here, which is, work safe work, working compensation, all of that. And then over here, you've got Fair Work, EDAs, unions, and it's sort of like never the two she'll meet. But yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a broader discussion, or maybe a discussion for kind of down the pub or something. But you know, I was trying to think about how and we were discussing, you know, with the guest is kind of how we found ourselves in a situation where we're in now, where worker power is a lot less than it was in the 70s and 80s, and yet on one level the regulation is maybe a bit more kind of prescriptive. It's like it's at least listing all of the psychosocial hazards. How's that going to work? So, you know, because arguably now the voting system is kind of in a bit of disarray when there isn't that kind of same worker voice that you had in the 70s and 80s. So, I mean.
That's fantastic.
And I think also in terms of sort of trying to chart that history, there's a bit, and again, this won't be a surprise to I asked the dance between practice and regulation. And I think that idea that the type of regulations that happen were a response to power and problems. And as we sort of drifted into the workplace system we have now, it's a manifestation of regulations that were fought for and argued over and discussed. And I think what we're doing now, not just here, but globally, and we look at sort of supranational organisations, look at, again, sort of what the paper authored by Francois, is that regulation is also changing again. And that always, there's a half a step behind is the practice that exists. And as regulation, for reasons of argumentation, for reasons of policy, have sort of started to encompass psychosocial health more explicitly, we then start to see practice jump again. And I think that's what, for me, I think better that looking back through the history, there's always that dance of being half a step ahead or half a step behind. And I think what's interesting for now is that we've sort of seen the regulation move half a step ahead again. And so that idea that practice follow because it's what people cry after. And so I think that's where that.
What role do you think US scholars and the institutions we're part of can play in shaping meaningful responses to psychosocial?
Yeah. Well, yes, speaking personally, I would like to see more IR scholarship on actual working conditions. Surprisingly, a lot of IR scholarship is, maybe not surprising, I don't know, but a lot of it is about institutions. And there's kind of a lot less case studies of actually what happens at work or actual sort of industrial disputes than you might think, and perhaps less than there used to be. So yeah, I would like to see more of that. And I mean, again, I think I agree with Tom. The Nazanin paper about the weaponising of menstruation in Bangladesh, was just a great sort of example of that. How power dynamics play out at work. Organisations. Let's talk about organisations. I think organisations need to stop looking at well-being as being about EAPs and mindfulness. And actually look at measures higher up the hierarchy of controls. So look at do we need to increase staffing levels? Do we need to reduce workload? All of those kinds of things, which we know from just so much research, so much international research over so many years, that is what actually reduces harm. So, reducing job insecurity. This is what we need to actually be seeing from organisations. In terms of other institutions, I think, I would like to see changes to industrial relations laws to make it less restrictive for the right to strike for unions, and that was, that's been a way that workers have fought for a lot of these gains historically. I think Australia has actually some of the most restrictive anti-strike laws in the world, which you know, I don't know, maybe it kind of sounds out there, but actually I would argue is kind of connected into a discussion about psychosocial hazards. And, you know, I think unions as well need to kind of reconsider a lot of their strategies. But I won't kind of go into my views on that. I do have a recently released book, if anyone would like to read that, Striking Laws. Yeah, so yeah, but yeah, I think there's a lot to do. Unfortunately, you know, there's maybe not as much getting done as we would like, as I would like.
I think when I sort of took this question in a slightly different manner, and by version talk about geography is very disciplined on my try their eyes. But it's also sort of conceptualising what working for people. And I've had the privilege of talking about a whole bunch of gig economy work over the last 8 years with colleagues and as part of my research agenda. And their working lives are structured so differently from how the award system presumes work is done. And I think this idea that work has fragmented and people are working multiple jobs, the number of people who I've spoken to the last couple of months who have full-time work and drive Uber on the side or do their tasks when these sorts of things. The working life is quite different, and the psychosocial factors associated with that are quite different. And I think sometimes regulators have this sort of presumption of a nuclear family or a harvester case and those kind of things. And I think it's not quite aligned with the reality of working life for people now. And as IR, we've been very good at founding the organisations to look at people covered by NDAs or by awards or by individual flexibility arrangements, whatever it is, and actually thinking that that's both not the whole worker necessarily, but it's also not the whole of work. And I think that if we're thinking about these things, this classic, I'm an academic and I can tell you a problem without a solution, difficult one. But it's that idea of reconceptualising a little bit what the experience of work is, because I think it's not quite what we presume it to be for everyone. I think that if we can encapsulate regulation to look after that a little bit better, I think we'll be a bit closer to resolving some of these issues in the psychotherapy.
And for the response on that, you can see Ursula's next. You was
All right.
It's
in this
on the topic. Please go ahead.
Listening to people who know some of the issues in the field as maybe like you did, there's such a bit of a confounding notion of what it all means, right? We're saying yes, it's been around for a long time, but as you said, each period of time, it's almost gets a new identity. And so then when we're kind of thinking, well, how do we respond in a practical as well as a policy way, I think a lot of people are a bit confounded by, well, what am I kind of responding to in terms of the issue? And I wonder whether you experience that even in terms of putting together the special issue. I know we have a process where, you can get script and all that sort of stuff, but at the same time, I'm wondering whether you yourselves kind of felt a bit of that struggle in terms of trying to really crystallise or focus enough to then build a special issue around that stands for psychosocial work and industrial relations.
And I think this is sort of, without wanting to go too much out of sausage was made, I think we have some very good conversations before us about what scripts wanted to include, because there were, I think, some high quality manuscripts that will be published if they haven't been already out there, but that we found work about the intersection between psychosocial hazards and IR, psychosocial hazards. And I learned a lot, and it wasn't the quality of the script, it's a total question. So I think that for us, and where we were coming from, it was about trying to have that dialogue and trying to frame the question more. Because I think, and this comes back to the point that I was, I think, trying to make in response to the first question about, well, you can deal with this question from a positivist safety science or economics perspective. And again, so it's probably confounding because we found that before this is inadequate. And I think the need to draw IR into it was a way of trying to get that. Because I think everyone recognises the problem. You can do it from a financial perspective, you can do it from an individual worker safety perspective, all these kind of things. And it's about finding better ways to get at it. Because I think, as you say, Danelle, I think the identity of the problem is a slippery one. And I think it also depends who's looking at it. And if you're looking at it as a practitioner who works within an organisation, I think you'd look at it from the organisation's perspective. but then you miss part of the story. But if you're looking at it from a Fair Work or the worksite perspective, you're looking at it from an industry perspective, you might lose what's happening with the individual firm and managerial problem. So I think that trying to get something like a multi-scale approach is the way forward. But there's that also adds a whole bunch of complexity. Did you want to?
No, because as you can also get
Yeah. I think, Janella, that's pretty much spot on the mark. We had a lot of conversations around it. But where we scoped it was that, historically, we've kind of looked at them in silos, work health and safety, and then, we have the IR regulations. Whereas what we found coming up with, with the new regulation thing introduced, it gave us the opportunity to kind of bring it back and see the overlaps with these two. In saying that, we also did find some gaps with the legislation where something, that would be classed as a psychosocial hazard is covered under work health and the safety legislation, but not necessarily under the Fair Work legislation. And so, and that's what contained our decision on what payments to accept and not.
yeah, got another question on that.
Sorry. No, go ahead, please. Danielle from Process Works. We deal with a lot of smaller organisations. And I'm just interested to ask you, because we've found it really challenging to kind of make clients be aware and responsive to psychosocial hazards. Do you think, coming from more an IR perspective, where I think you made some really good things about, you said we need to, increase staffing levels, we need to look at insecure work. Do you think, coming from that angle, because that's kind of what I'm getting from tonight, coming from more of an IR angle, could be more effective in helping organisations address it? Because in our experience at the moment, they all just look at it and are just don't know what to do. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure. I'm the best people to give advice. I mean, I think the language of psychosocial hazard is not kind of widely known. I don't think. I mean, yeah, seems like random enough for it. I had to Google the term when I first went for the job at for 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, maybe the language is intimidating for people, but understanding that actually it's stresses at work, it's workplace stress that's caused by humans. I think the concepts in a sense aren't that hard. I think you do get pushback a lot of the time from organisations where they're like, oh, well, we can't increase staffing levels because of budget. We can't reduce workload because of, there's always that kind of, or maybe they think, well, that's an IR issue and not a work health and safety issue. But yeah, I mean, if that's like a better way to explain it to
because I just think people, and please, anyone who disagrees with me, but generally, our clients generally do tend to kind of freak out and switch off. It's just a horrible term, right? Psychosocial hazards. It's just, for a small business owner. And I think, I don't know. I think so much of what you're saying tonight, unfortunately, I haven't read the article yet, but put it in the context of IR, I think it makes it much more relatable for business rather than sitting in that safety space.
Patty, do you respond to that?
Well, no, I don't want to respond to that, but I have a question about the nature of compliance in this space and whether what we needed in terms of these particular hazards is the real reframing of an approach that can sit in the IR space. Because I'm concerned, my big concern around the codes of practice and the regulation around this issue is this drive for compliance actually drives organisational behaviour to do the bare minimum. And to tick a box, as opposed to actually addressing the issue. I wonder sometimes if that's what makes it overwhelming for organisations to address, because as long as we can comply, then we're okay, but whether that's actually resolving the issue is...
And I think so to respond to, both questions, and I think where I go back to in terms of sort of my reading, my understanding of work is that the ILO agenda around decent work. And that idea is if you're thinking about providing people decent work, these things should be resolved, as opposed to the bare minimum plus a tiny bit of leeway as a way of getting around it or getting through it, I suppose. So if your starting point is creating decent work in whatever the context is, that might be another way of sort of engaging the sort of discourse about, unsafe work is clearly decent work, right? And that's I'm going to find arguments in this room around that statement. And it's about the scope of where that indecent work might sit, I think, which is, again, I also find it from an IR perspective, it's a better explanation than just safety science. Biased, an IR person, right? And it's the way I see the world. But maybe that was the other way that I'm sort of thinking about how you resolve this from a more systematic level than resolving individual problems and one person being stressed or otherwise, is saying, is this an environment that's conducive to decent work? And even so gig work that I look at, and sort of my empirical specialisation now, in many ways it is for the people who do it. And there's a paper we've put out recently for workers with disability who find the work very rewarding, because their disability pension is a little bit buffered from some of the income insecurity, and they find the work very rewarding. So work which is by the objective measures perhaps not of such a good quality, but these workers is providing a decent working environment. So it's a small subset, and it's not representative of rideshare work in general, but it's creating an environment where people feel like they're doing decent work with satisfaction. So I think that decent work is a way to be creating systems and workplaces where that's being facilitated from a physical safety and a mental safety perspective. That might be an alternate way of framing up the problem. Is that?
Yeah, no, I think that probably kind of what I was trying to say. I think is talk about it in real language. And I think you often get pushback about, say, having to increase staffing or something. But I think if you can explain to businesses that overall long-term consequences, I'm not talking about compliance, breach and fines, I'm talking about like not being able to train people, losing people, presentism, all those things, then they are more aware.
Very lively discussion might look like for practitioners. What do you think are the most promising directions for psychosocial work as
Yeah, I'd really like to see more on the impact of unions on reducing psychosocial hazards. There is a little bit of research out there. Maureen Dollard, who I think has joined us on Teams and was a co-author for the article about university restructuring during COVID, actually has some work that's sort of high level sort of quantitative work about countries where there is higher union density correlates with a better psychosocial safety climate. So I'd like to see more about the impact of unions and perhaps kind of case studies at a more kind of ground level or country level. I would love to see more on blue collar workers. I think sometimes academics like to write about ourselves, and I think sometimes HR people think that the world is just office workers in large companies, and it's not. So it's very pleasing that that there was one contribution that you could sort of say was that kind of blue collar workers. In the global south as well. There were 4 articles about white collar workers, which again is a very large section of the workforce. But I do feel like the blue collar workers kind of sometimes get left out in this.
Sorry, in relation to that, would you not link some of your articles that come out about FIFO workers in particular? I feel like they were the first sort of group of people that we were starting to talk about psychosocial hazards before white collar, that they could be counted as they working.
I think that's true. Yeah, I guess. Some of my stuff, is about kind of unionism in the Pilbara, and which has kind of looked more at the historical stuff, but I have kind of looked a bit at the contemporary stuff and FIFO workers. What I've found is that a lot of the studies on FIFO work were great in kind of exposing the problem, the mental distress, the suicide, all of that kind of thing, the impact of rosters on all those kinds of issues. They mainly didn't have an IR kind of perspective, and I think some of the sort of solutions that are often posed, frankly, I think are unrealistic. There's only so much that you can do in terms of kind of like building communities, in terms of like the actual FIFO camps. Like it's just not realistic to have like relaxation rooms and stuff for like after people's 12-hour shifts or so I don't know. Again, I think some of the structural issues or just the kind of reducing stigma. I mean, that's great. Like we do need to reduce mental health stigma everywhere, but there's actually a real issue when you've got kind of multinational companies, low union density, and workplaces that are frankly pretty authoritarian on the ground. So I don't know. I think yes, there has been and continues to be some great work on FIFO workers, but I would like to see more and maybe doing more with colleagues, with more of an IR kind of thing.
I did manage to have one question from online. I follow up on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong. The person online who asked this was saying I apologize. Why do you think that is with the FIFO work? Why do you think we don't have this sort of IR focused research in this space?
I mean, I think it kind of goes back with that divide that we've got. I mean, and my background is as a labour historian, and then sort of moved into IR, but then I got a job at ECU in what was then the Centre for Work and Wellbeing, and so then that sort of opened my eyes to this kind of whole other field of research. Like there's just whole conferences and journals that deal with working conditions and kind of health outcomes of working conditions that by and large like IR scholars just aren't sort of aware of. So yeah, I don't know. It's just
So you mentioned earlier that Dollar has been contributed and online and the hand raised to contribute. Please forgive me if I'm going to cause massive feedback.
You know what we can do, if you don't mind, is take the slide off, and then we can see our
I
online.
think it might pause for some more discussion. If there's one idea you hope readers take away from this issue, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a tough question, isn't it?
To pick one is hard, but
What about 3?
That's one idea, but it's in 3 parts and that's 30,000 clicks.
Well, I guess firstly the seriousness of the issue. The psychosocial hazards really cause like significant distress, and there's even in I think our introductory paper reference to work-related suicide, which is massively actually prevalent, but not reported or counted very well, and not much discussed. But you could actually class that as an epidemic, really. So massively important issue. I think the point about making changes up the top of the hierarchy of control, organisational level changes, and not blaming the individual, and certainly not kind of misappropriating the language of psychosocial hazards and psychosocial safety, as does happen sometimes. And then thirdly, just the and I guess we kind of hammered this, but just how intrinsic kind of power dynamics at work, and the broader broader environment of, well, I'm a Marxist, so the broader environment of capitalism, how that impacts. So yeah, that's
brilliant. Yeah, a great agreement.
For me, with the last question, the one takeaway is how critical this stuff is to constructing a decent working life. And I think that idea is if and our academics, we look at organisations and we look at organisations as providing people with these opportunities and people who live and exist within them and work as a fundamental part of existence for many people on this planet. And that if this stuff is done right and these risks are mitigated, it goes a long way to helping people construct decent working lives where they can, not just exist and toil, but actually construct something really positive and progressive and advance in these things. And I think it's if we can connect, and I think it comes back to the question before, if we can connect these things to the quality of life that people have within the workplace and beyond it, I think that's probably the framing that I got out of reading the articles for the special issue, is that when these things are done badly, it really has a caustic effect. And when it is done well, both from an IR and a psychosocial hazard perspective, it's where you can really build something wonderful in workplaces. And I think that, flipping it around and thinking about it in a slightly positive way, maybe is naive or optimistic, but I think it can be.
Amazing. Yes, go ahead, please.
And I agree with our co-editors here that you asked for one, and I would put this into one word: systemic. The question you raise is a very important one. Rather than looking at an isolated case of, let's say, sexual harassment, or an isolated case of somebody having, some mental health incident, it's understanding what existed before. Was it overwork? Was it work precarity? So it's coming to understand psychosocial hazards in the systemic whole and addressing it in that way. And the IR regulatory frameworks, I think, help a lot in that respect of seeing it